Hey guys, tonight we are diving into one of the most persistent and puzzling themes in the Old Testament: the magnetic, almost gravitational pull that false gods had on the people of Israel. Imagine you're standing in an endless, sun-scorched desert. The leader who brought you out of slavery, the only one who seems to talk to the terrifying, invisible God who split the sea for you, has vanished into a smoking, thundering mountain for 40 days. Silence stretches. Fear begins to crawl up your spine, cold and sharp. Let's be brutally honest. Faced with that kind of cosmic silence and existential dread, you probably wouldn't survive without trying to create a God you could see, touch, and understand. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And just for fun, I'd love to see where you're all tuning in from. Drop your city or country and the local time in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. The story doesn't really start at the mountain. That's where the fireworks are, certainly. It's where contracts are drafted in lightning, signed in terror, and then spectacularly broken before the ink is metaphorically dry. But the real beginning, the deep, foundational reason why it all went so very wrong so very fast, starts centuries earlier. It begins in the fertile black mud of the Nile Delta, under the oppressive, shimmering, ever-present gaze of the Egyptian sun. For 400 years, the children of Israel had lived, worked, and died in a world that was absolutely saturated with gods. It wasn't just a culture with a religion. It was a civilization where the divine and the mundane were so intricately woven together that to separate them would be to unravel the fabric of reality itself. You couldn't throw a stone in any direction without hitting a shrine, a temple, an obelisk, a pylon, or a statue dedicated to someone in the vast, sprawling, and frankly, quite chaotic Egyptian pantheon. Their world wasn't merely religious. It was magical, teeming with unseen forces that had to be placated, negotiated with, and appeased at every turn. Imagine, for a moment, you are an Israelite brickmaker in the land of Goshen during the reign of a powerful pharaoh. Your day begins before dawn, but the first true event is the arrival of the sun. This isn't just a celestial body. It is the great god Ra, climbing into his solar bark, the Manjet, to begin his perilous journey across the sky, battling the serpent of chaos, Apep, every night to ensure he can rise again the next morning. The intense, baking heat on your back as you stoop to mix straw and clay is not just weather. It is the tangible presence of Ra's power. Your life, and all life, depends on his victory. The mighty Nile River, the source of all fertility and life in this desert land, is not just a river. It is the domain of Hapi, the androgynous god of the inundation, whose annual flood deposits the rich silt that makes agriculture possible. Its waters are sacred. Its fish are his bounty. And the crocodiles that lurk in its shallows are living manifestations of the god Sobek, creatures of immense power and divine significance. When you take a break to eat your meager lunch of bread and onions you are partaking in the blessings of Osiris, the once human king who became the god of agriculture, death, and resurrection. His story of being murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Set, and painstakingly reassembled by his devoted wife Isis, is the foundational myth of death and rebirth, mirroring the cycle of the crops that rise from the earth each year. When your wife is in the throes of labor, her cries are mingled with prayers to Taweret, the grotesque yet fiercely protective goddess of childbirth, depicted as a composite of a hippopotamus, a lion, and a crocodile. Standing alongside her in spirit is the dwarf god Bes, a wild-looking, tongue-lolling figure whose fearsome appearance was believed to ward off evil spirits that might harm the mother or child. Every single aspect of your existence, from the monumental construction of a pyramid to the simple act of brewing beer, a gift from the goddess Hathor, was governed by a specific deity you could name, picture, and most importantly, interact with. And interacting with them was a profoundly visual and tangible experience. The Egyptian gods were not abstract philosophical concepts. They were a feast for the senses, a riot of form and color. You had Horus, the majestic falcon-headed son of Isis and Osiris, whose earthly incarnation was the pharaoh himself. His eye, the Udjat, was a powerful symbol of protection and healing, painted on buildings and worn as amulets. You had Anubis, the solemn jackal-headed guide of the dead, who would meet you in the afterlife to weigh your heart against the feather of Mad, the goddess of truth and cosmic order. A heavy heart, weighed down by sin, would be devoured by the monster Ammit. A light heart would grant you passage to the afterlife. There was Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, magic, and writing, the celestial scribe who recorded the verdict of the heart-weighing ceremony. There was Sekhmet, the terrifying lioness-headed goddess of war, plague, and divine retribution, whose fiery breath was the scorching desert wind itself. These weren't just stories whispered around a fire. They were inescapable realities carved into every temple wall, painted in vibrant colors inside every tomb, inscribed on every papyrus scroll, and molded into countless amulets, statues, and household idols. The gods had faces. They had bodies, often a hybrid of human and animal, that symbolized their specific powers and domains. The falcon represented Horus's dominion over the sky and his sharp, kingly vision. The jackal represented Anubis's connection to the necropolis, as jackals were often seen prowling the edges of the desert where the dead were buried. The cow, a symbol of motherhood and nourishment, was sacred to Hathor. This visual, symbolic language was the primary way people understood and related to the divine. Worship, therefore, was a deeply practical and often transactional affair. You felt a pain in your side. You might make a small offering to Sekhmet to appease her wrath. Your cow isn't producing milk. A prayer and a gift to Hathor was in order. The system was vast and complex, managed by a powerful and wealthy priesthood. The great temples at Karnak or Luxor were not just places of worship. They were massive economic engines, owning vast tracts of land, employing thousands of people, and serving as centers of learning and political power. For the common person, religion meant bringing a small offering, a bit of grain, a miniature clay figurine of the god, a loaf of specially baked bread to a local shrine, or the outer courts of a temple. You would say a prayer, make your request, and leave your offering, hoping the god would look upon you with favor. It was a system. It had rules, rituals, and a clear hierarchy. It made a chaotic and often brutal world feel somewhat manageable. And above all, it was concrete. You could point to a towering statue of Ramesses II and say, "There, that is the son of Ra." You could hold a small amulet of Isis and say, "She is protecting my child." This is a profoundly comforting way to live when your life is precarious, when you feel powerless against disease, famine, and the whims of your human masters. You want a God you can see, a power you can locate in space and time. Now, into this deeply ingrained world of sight, sound, and ritual comes the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And what is his primary, defining characteristic for these people? His utter, uncompromising invisibility. What does he look like? The question itself is blasphemy. Where is his statue? To even consider making one is the greatest of sins. Where is his grand temple? It doesn't exist. For the average Israelite slave, Yahweh was a half-forgotten family story, a whisper of a special destiny passed down from grandfather to father to son. He was the God of the ancestors, a God of promises, a God of a covenant made hundreds of years ago with men who were now nothing but dust. He was not a daily, visible presence like the gods of their Egyptian neighbors and masters. He was a voice that had once spoken to Abraham, a presence that had wrestled with Jacob, and most recently, a fire that had burned in a bush without consuming it. He was a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, powerful phenomena, to be sure, but shapeless, formless, and terrifyingly mobile. He could not be depicted, contained, or controlled. To shift one's entire spiritual framework from the tangible polytheism of Egypt to this radical, aniconic monotheism is a psychological and theological leap of staggering proportions. It's like asking someone who has only ever known how to count on their fingers to suddenly grasp the concept of infinity. The Israelites were being commanded, in essence, to unlearn 4 centuries of cultural and religious programming. They had to erase the mental images of Horus and Ra and Anubis and replace them with what? A void, a voice, a feeling, an idea. They were spiritual toddlers, and their very first lesson was in the most advanced subject imaginable: faith in a God who resolutely refused to be seen. This is the crucial context for the 10 plagues. They were not just a series of escalating ecological disasters designed to strong-arm Pharaoh. They were a systematic, targeted, and brutal theological education for both the Egyptians and the Israelites. It was a cosmic showdown, a divine duel. The invisible, formless God of a tribe of slaves versus the the entire spectacular pantheon of the most powerful empire on the planet. Each plague was a direct assault on a specific Egyptian deity, a demonstration of power designed to prove that the gods of Egypt were nothing more than empty names and powerless idols. Consider the progression. The first plague, the Nile, the very artery of Egypt, turns to blood. This was not just an inconvenience, it was a declaration of war against the entire cosmic order as the Egyptians understood it. Hapi, the god of the inundation, was rendered impotent. Osiris, whose body was said to be the fertile earth and whose lifeblood was the river, was symbolically slain. The fish, sacred to other gods, died and rotted in the polluted waters. The message was unequivocal. Your river gods, the very source of your life, are powerless before me. The second plague, frogs. The goddess Hecate, the frog-headed deity of fertility and childbirth, was one of the most revered in the land. Suddenly, her sacred animal becomes a disgusting, swarming pestilence, hopping into people's beds, their kneading bowls, their ovens. It's a grotesque parody of fertility. Your goddess of life cannot control her own symbol. In fact, her symbol now brings contamination and chaos, and the lesson continues relentlessly. The gnats, emerging from the dust of the earth, are a mockery of Geb, the earth god. The swarms of flies are an affront to the gods who were supposed to control the air. The death of the livestock is a direct and devastating blow against some of the most important deities in the pantheon. Hathor, the gentle mother goddess, often depicted as a cow or a woman with cow's ears, could not protect her sacred animals. And most significantly, the plague struck down the Apis bull, a creature considered to be the living incarnation of the god Ptah, a physical manifestation of divinity on earth. The death of the sacred bull would have sent a shockwave of theological terror through the entire nation. The hail and fire, the swarms of locusts, these were attacks on Nut, the sky goddess, and the various gods of agriculture and the harvest. But the ninth plague was perhaps the most profound. A deep, thick, oppressive darkness that smothered the land for 3 days. A darkness so absolute it could be felt. This was a direct assault on the king of the gods himself, the mighty Ra. For 3 days, the sun god failed to rise. His solar bark was, in effect, sunk. The most powerful, visible, and universally worshipped deity in Egypt was simply snuffed out like a candle. Imagine the existential dread, the sheer terror that would have gripped the hearts of the Egyptians. The source of all light and life was gone. The God of the Hebrews, this invisible entity with no sunboat and no temple, had just effortlessly defeated the sun itself. The final plague was the most terrible and the most personal. The death of every firstborn son. In Egyptian theology, Pharaoh was not just a king. He was a god on earth, the living embodiment of Horus. His heir, the crown prince, was therefore a god in waiting. This plague was not just a tragedy. It was the ultimate theological statement. It demonstrated that the gods of Egypt, the divine Pharaoh, and the future divine Pharaoh were all subject to death at the command of Yahweh. "There is no one like me," was the implicit message. Your entire system is a sham. Your gods are helpless, and your king is merely a man. For the Israelites, huddled in their homes behind doors marked with the blood of a sacrificial lamb, this must have been a night of both terror and revelation. They were being spared, but they were also being taught a brutal, unforgettable lesson. They were witnessing, in real time, the complete and utter demolition of the religious worldview they had known their entire lives. The lesson was supposed to be seared into their collective soul. All those magnificent statues, all those powerful animal gods, all those awe-inspiring temples are nothing. They are empty constructs. The only true power, the only real God, is the one you cannot see, the one who is, at this very moment, leading you out of centuries of bondage with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. So they leave. In a chaotic, exultant, terrified exodus, a whole nation walks out of Egypt, leaving 400 years of history behind them. As a final, parting miracle, they witness the sea itself split open, creating a dry path for them to walk through, with walls of water on either side. It's a moment of creation being deconstructed and reconstructed for their benefit. And then those walls of water collapse, drowning the entire pursuing Egyptian army, the chariots, the horses, the symbols of Pharaoh's might. They are free. They are in the desert, and they are utterly alone with their invisible God. Journey from the sea to the foot of Mount Sinai is a crucible. The initial ecstasy of freedom quickly evaporates under the harsh glare of the desert sun. The realities of survival set in. It's hot, dusty, and monotonous. The water they find at Marah is bitter and undrinkable. Soon, the food they brought from Egypt runs out, and the people, predictably, begin to grumble. Their complaints, recorded with unflinching honesty in the book of Exodus, reveal their slave mentality is still deeply ingrained. If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. It sounds petulant and profoundly ungrateful, but you can almost understand it. In Egypt, their lives were brutal, but they were predictable. There was a routine. There was food, even if it was the food of slaves. There was water from the Nile. There was a system they understood. Here, in the vast, terrifying emptiness of the Sinai Peninsula, there is nothing but sand, rock, and the promise of a God they can't see. They are being forced to learn a new way of life. Total, moment-by-moment dependence on Him for everything. And it is a stressful, frightening education. God, of course, provides. He instructs Moses to throw a piece of wood into the bitter water at Marah, and it becomes sweet. When they cry out for food, He provides manna, a strange, miraculous bread-like substance that appears on the ground with the morning dew, and quail that fly into the camp in the evening. When they thirst again, He brings water gushing from a solid rock at Horeb. He is teaching them, day by painful day, to trust His provision, to live by faith, not by sight. But the old instincts, the desire for something predictable, for a resource they can control, are hard to shake. And then they arrive at the foot of Sinai. This is the destination, the place where the informal family relationship is to be formalized into a national covenant, the place where the whispered stories of the patriarchs will become the written constitution of a new nation. The sight that greets them is terrifying. The mountain is wrapped in a thick, dark cloud. God descends upon it in fire, and the smoke billows up like the smoke from a furnace. The whole mountain trembles violently. The sound of a shofar, a ram's horn, grows louder and louder, an unearthly blast that seems to shake their very bones. This is not the gentle, comforting presence of a household god. This is awesome, overwhelming cosmic power. It is a theophany, a manifestation of God, designed to instill in them a profound sense of awe and reverence and fear. God is near, but he is also dangerously, terrifyingly holy. A boundary is established. The people are commanded not to even touch the base of the mountain, on pain of death. There is a separation between the holy and the common, and they are firmly on the side of the common. Moses alone is called to ascend, to act as the mediator, the bridge between this consuming holiness and the trembling mass of people below. And from the fire and smoke, God lays out the foundational principles of their relationship, the 10 Commandments. The first 2 are the pillars upon which everything else rests. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. It's a statement of identity and history. He grounds his authority not in some abstract claim to creatorhood, but in the concrete, shared memory of their liberation. He is the God who saved them. Then, immediately, comes the second command, the great prohibition that sets them apart from every other nation on earth. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. This is the radical core of their new identity. It's not just a suggestion to be monotheistic. It is an absolute, uncompromising ban on the primary mode of religious expression known to humanity at the time. No images, no statues, no carvings, no visual aids. All the things that made religion feel real, tangible, and accessible to them are now strictly forbidden. Their worship is to be directed towards a being they cannot see, cannot sculpt, and cannot physically locate. The God who is pure spirit demands a worship that is primarily spiritual, an affair of the heart, the mind, and the will, not of the eyes and hands. And he uses that startlingly intimate and possessive word, jealous. It's the language of a marriage covenant. He sees their allegiance to other gods not as a theological error, but as adultery. He demands exclusive devotion. He will not tolerate rivals for their affection. The people, standing at a safe distance, are utterly terrified by the spectacle. The thunder, the lightning, the smoking mountain, the voice of God, it's too much. They shrink back and say to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." They are so overwhelmed by the direct experience of God's holiness that they immediately demand a mediator. And so, through Moses, they agree to the terms of the covenant. They promise to obey all that the Lord has said. The covenant is sealed with sacrifices, and the elders of Israel even share a symbolic meal in the presence of God on the mountain. Then Moses is called to go back up the mountain. He is to receive the rest of the law, the detailed civil and ceremonial instructions for how they are to live as God's covenant people. And he is to receive the physical expression of the covenant, 2 stone tablets inscribed with the 10 Commandments by the very finger of God. He takes his aide, Joshua, with him part of the way, and tells the elders he will be gone for a while. The cloud of God's glory covers the mountain, and Moses enters the cloud. He will be there for 40 days and 40 nights. Down below, in the sprawling camp at the foot of the mountain, the great wait begins. For the first few days, there is likely a buzz of anticipation and residual awe. Their leader is in a private audience with the Almighty. They are at the epicenter of a world-changing event. But as the days stretch into a week, and then 2, the atmosphere begins to change. The smoke still wreathes the peak, and the fire of God's glory still glows like a beacon in the night. But there is an unnerving silence. The thundering voice is gone. The pronouncements have ceased. There is just the relentless sun, the daily routine of gathering manna, and the oppressive, waiting silence. By the 3rd week, the anxiety is palpable. Whispers start to circulate through the tents. Where is Moses? What could possibly be taking so long? Is he even still alive? That fire on the summit looks like a consuming furnace, a volcano. Perhaps God, in his terrifying holiness, has simply incinerated him. Imagine the conversations. An old woman who remembers the bitterness of slavery, her faith firm, trying to reassure her anxious grandchildren. A group of young men, born in the desert, restless and impatient, arguing that they have been abandoned. The elders try to maintain order, but their own faces are etched with worry. By day 30, the anxiety is hardening into fear. By day 35, it is curdling into full-blown panic. Their mediator is gone. The one man who could bridge the gap between them and the terrifying God on the mountain has vanished. They feel like orphans, abandoned in the middle of a vast and hostile wilderness, with no map and no guide. The link between them and the divine has been severed. That awesome, holy God on the mountain is no longer a comforting presence. He is a remote, silent, and frightening power source, utterly inaccessible to them. The old fears, the old instincts, the deeply ingrained Egyptian programming from 4 centuries of cultural immersion begin to surface with irresistible force. This invisible God is too distant, too demanding, too silent. We need something here with us in the camp. We need a God we can see, a God who is present, a God who will lead us now. The simmering panic finally boils over. It finds a voice, then 100 voices, then 1,000. A crowd forms, a chaotic, churning mass of fearful, angry people. They surge through the camp, their destination clear. The tent of Aaron, Moses' brother, the high priest in waiting, the man left in charge. Imagine the scene from Aaron's perspective. The roar of the crowd growing louder, the dust rising, the press of desperate, demanding bodies at the entrance to his tent. faces are tight with anxiety, their voices a desperate, unified chorus. Up, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses, the man who brought us up out of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him. The insult in their language is sharp. Moses is no longer their great deliverer. He is this fellow Moses, a man who has disappeared and is now presumed dead or irrelevant. Their demand is specific and revealing. Make us gods, plural. They are not just seeking a replacement for Moses. They are seeking a replacement for the God of Moses. They are reverting to the familiar polytheistic mindset of Egypt. They don't want a single, invisible, jealous God who makes inconvenient moral demands. They want manageable, visible deities who can be carried along with them, whose presence is reassuringly physical. They want to go back to the religious system they know and understand. All the pressure of that moment, all the fear and expectation of a million people comes to bear on one man, Aaron. This is one of the most debated and tragic moral failures in the entire Old Testament. What is going on in Aaron's mind? The text doesn't give us his internal monologue, leaving us to speculate. Is he a weak man, a people pleaser, simply terrified of the mob, and caving to their demands to save his own skin? Is he a secret cynic, one who never fully bought into his brother's radical vision of an imageless God? Or is he, perhaps, a desperate pragmatist? Does he see a nation on the verge of a violent, chaotic riot and think he can control the situation, that he can channel their panicked religious energy into a supervised project rather than letting it splinter into a dozen different homegrown cults? Whatever his motivation, his actions are a catastrophic failure of leadership and faith. He doesn't rebuke them. He doesn't stand up and remind them of the 10 plagues, of the parting of the sea, of the manna that fed them just that morning. He doesn't point to the smoking mountain just a few hundred yards away and say, "Have you all gone mad?" We just heard the voice of God himself declare, "You shall not make for yourself an image." He doesn't try to reason with them or call them to prayer and patience. Instead, he capitulates immediately. His instructions are shockingly practical and immediate. Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me. It might have been a subtle ploy, a gamble. Perhaps he thought their avarice would overcome their fear. Surely they wouldn't be willing to part with their precious family jewelry, their portable wealth. But he catastrophically underestimates the power of their existential terror. Fear is a far more powerful motivator than greed. They don't hesitate. A wave of motion goes through the camp as people strip themselves of their gold, the very gold that, according to the Exodus account, they had received from their Egyptian neighbors on the night they left. It was the plunder of their oppressors, the first fruits of their freedom, a tangible symbol of God's judgment on Egypt and his favor upon them. And now, this symbol of their liberation is about to be melted down to forge the instrument of their new enslavement. A great pile of gold grows before Aaron's tent. Rings, bracelets, necklaces, and thousands of earrings, glinting in the harsh desert sun. a mountain of memories, of wealth, of vanity, is now ready to be repurposed. Aaron takes the gold from their hands, and the scripture tells us he made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. This is no accident, no spontaneous event. This is a deliberate act of skilled craftsmanship. He melts the gold in a crucible, prepares a mold of sand or clay, pours the molten metal, and waits for it to cool. Then, with an engraver's tool, he refines the shape, carving details into the surface, giving the inert metal the form and texture of a living creature. And why a calf? Or, more accurately, a young bull? As we touched on before, this was not a random choice of animal. It was a direct and deliberate theological statement, a callback to the religious world they had just left. The most powerful and famous animal cult in all of Egypt was the cult of the Apis bull. A live bull, identified by specific sacred markings, was believed to be the living, breathing incarnation of the creator god Ptah, or sometimes Osiris. This sacred bull was housed in a magnificent temple in the capital city of Memphis, where it was pampered, fed, and worshipped by priests and pilgrims. It was consulted as an oracle. Its movements were interpreted as divine pronouncements. When the Apis bull died, the entire nation of Egypt would go into mourning, as if a pharaoh had passed. It was then mummified with immense pomp and buried in a huge stone sarcophagus in the Serapeum. The image of the bull was everywhere in Egypt, a universal and instantly recognizable symbol of strength, fertility, virility, and divine power. For this desperate, leaderless crowd of former slaves, a golden bull was the most obvious and potent image of deity they could possibly conceive. It was strong, it was visible, it was valuable, and it was deeply familiar. It was everything their invisible, silent, and formless God was not. The moment the finished calf is unveiled, gleaming and golden and solid under the desert sky, a collective sigh of relief, followed by an ecstatic cheer, erupts from the crowd. The unbearable tension of the last 40 days is broken. The existential dread is banished. They have a God again, a God they can see, a God they can touch, a God that is right here in the middle of their camp. And then, the people, or perhaps Aaron seeking to validate his actions, make the most astonishing and horrifically blasphemous declaration imaginable. These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. The audacity is breathtaking. They look at this inert lump of melted jewelry, a thing they had just made with their own hands from their own possessions, and they attribute to it the supreme act of salvation in their entire history. They credit this lifeless statue with the 10 plagues, with the defeat of Pharaoh, with the splitting of the Red Sea. They have taken the magnificent, uncontainable, transcendent power of the creator of the universe and projected it onto a small, man-made object. They have replaced the stunning reality of God with a cheap symbol, and then they have worshipped the symbol as if it were the reality. This is the very definition, the very essence of idolatry. Aaron, perhaps seeing how well this has gone over with the crowd, and now fully committed to the charade, tries to put a Yahwistic spin on the pagan proceedings. He builds an altar in front of the calf. He steps forward and makes a formal announcement. Tomorrow, there will be a festival to the Lord. He uses the personal covenant name of God, Yahweh. This is another fascinating and tragic detail. It strongly suggests that, in their confused and frightened minds, they weren't necessarily rejecting Yahweh outright. They were attempting to domesticate him. They were trying to worship the God of Moses in a way that was comfortable and familiar to them, the Egyptian way. Their thinking was likely, this golden bull will be the visible throne, the pedestal, the representation of the invisible God, Yahweh, who saved us. They couldn't handle the pure abstraction of an imageless God, so they created a concrete object to focus their worship on. They couldn't endure the divine silence, so they created a God who was silent by its very nature. But in doing so, in trying to help God be more user-friendly, they broke the most fundamental law of their new relationship. They violated his otherness. They tried to reduce the infinite creator to the status of a finite creature. They tried to control the uncontrollable, to contain the uncontainable, and to represent the unrepresentable. The next day, the festival begins. It is a full-blown syncretistic pagan celebration at the foot of God's holy mountain. The text says, "They rose early the next day and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings." They are using the proper forms and language of Yahwistic worship, but the spirit is all wrong. The purpose is idolatrous, and the solemnity quickly devolves into chaos. Afterward, they sat down to eat and drink, and got up to indulge in revelry. The Hebrew word used for revelry here is the same word used to describe Potiphar's wife's advances on Joseph. It has strong connotations of wild, chaotic, sexually charged, and unrestrained behavior. This was not a holy convocation. This was a pagan rave. It was a complete and utter rejection of the sacred order, the moral holiness, and the reverent awe that their God had demanded of them. They were dancing, singing, feasting, and fornicating before their new golden God, while the true and living God watched from the fiery peak just above their heads. Up on that mountain, in the midst of revealing the glorious designs for the tabernacle, the very place where his presence would dwell among them, God knows exactly what is happening below. His conversation with Moses turns instantly from creation to judgment. The tone shifts from intimate instruction to ice-cold fury. "Go down," God says to Moses, "because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed down to it and sacrificed to it, and have said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.'" Pay close attention to God's language. He distances himself from them in their sin. He doesn't say "my people" as he usually does. He says to Moses, "your people." It's the heartbroken, wounded language of a betrayed husband. You deal with them. They are your problem now. The divine indictment is swift and damning. "I have seen these people," the Lord said to Moses, "and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation. This is a truly staggering moment. God offers Moses a deal that would tempt any mortal leader. He offers to press the reset button on history. He will wipe the slate clean, annihilate this rebellious, ungrateful nation, and start over with Moses alone. Moses will become the new Abraham, the patriarch of a new chosen people, a great nation descended from him. The covenant would be transferred. For a terrifying moment, the fate of an entire people hangs in the balance, dependent on the character and response of one man. And it is here that Moses, the once hesitant shepherd with a speech impediment, reveals his true greatness. He has been transformed by his time in the presence of God. He has become a true intercessor, a true shepherd who loves his flawed and foolish flock. He rises to their defense, not by excusing their sin, but by appealing to God's own character. He dares to argue with God. He doesn't say, "Oh, they're just scared, Lord. They didn't really mean it." He knows exactly how heinous their sin is. Instead, his appeal is a brilliant, three-pronged argument aimed at the very heart of God. First, he appeals to God's past actions and his ownership. "O Lord," he pleads, "why should your anger burn against your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand?" He gently but firmly hands the ownership back to God. They are yours, not mine. You are the one who invested in them. You are the one who performed the miracles. You have too much skin in the game to quit now. Second, he appeals to God's reputation, his public relations among the other nations. Why should the Egyptians say, "It was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains, and to wipe them off the face of the earth"? This is a masterful argument. Moses is essentially saying, think about your glory, your name in the world. If you destroy them now, the Egyptians will spin this story forever. They will say your salvation was a sham, a cruel trick to lure your people into the desert to annihilate them. They will conclude that you are either a malevolent God or a weak one who couldn't finish what he started. Your own reputation is at stake. Finally, and most powerfully, he appeals to God's promises, to the unshakable foundation of the covenant itself. Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in Thesky, and I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever. Moses is holding God's own sworn oath up to him. He is reminding God that the covenant is not based on the people's fleeting faithfulness, but on God's unchanging character and his sovereign promises. It is one of the most audacious and beautiful prayers in the entire Bible. Moses stands in the breach, shielding his people from the righteous firestorm they have provoked. And the scripture records a truly stunning response. Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened. So Moses turns and goes down the mountain. In his hands, he carries the 2 tablets of the testimony, slabs of stone quarried by the mountain, but inscribed by the very finger of God. They are the physical embodiment of the covenant, the marriage contract between Yahweh and Israel. As he and Joshua, who has been waiting for him further down, get closer to the camp, they begin to hear the noise rising up from the valley floor. Joshua, the military man, hears it through a soldier's ears. "There is the sound of war in the camp," he says, alert for an attack. But Moses, his heart already heavy with God's report, knows better. He hears the truth in the chaotic sound. It is not the sound of victory. It is not the sound of defeat. It is the sound of singing that I hear. It is not the cry of battle. It is the sound of profane revelry, of idolatrous celebration. And then he rounds a final bend in the path, and he sees it with his own eyes. The sprawling camp spread out before him. And there, in the center of it all, catching the sunlight, is the golden calf. And his people, the people he has risked everything for, the people whose very existence he just pleaded for, are dancing and singing and debasing themselves around it like the pagans they had just been rescued from. In that moment, seeing the betrayal with his own eyes, something inside him snaps. The carefully controlled intercessor gives way to the fiery prophet. Moses' anger burned, and he threw the tablets out of his hands, breaking them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. This is not a mere fit of temper. It is a profoundly symbolic act. The covenant, the sacred contract between God and the people, lies shattered in the dust. He threw down the law because they had already spiritually broken it. The physical pieces of the tablets were a perfect, heartbreaking image of the spiritual state of the nation. Their promises were in ruins. Moses' righteous fury propels him into the camp like a storm. He takes the calf, the object of their worship, the supposed source of their salvation, and he puts it through a methodical process of utter desecration and humiliation. First, he burns it in the fire. This beautiful, gleaming golden idol, the product of so much wealth and craftsmanship, melts back into an ugly, shapeless, blackened lump of metal. Then, he grinds what's left of it into a fine powder, as fine as dust. He pulverizes their powerful god, reducing it to nothing. Then, he takes that gold dust and scatters it on the stream that flows down from the mountain. And finally, in a stroke of dreadful, poetic justice, he makes the Israelites drink the water. He forces them to ingest their own sin. He makes them consume the physical remnants of their faithlessness. Their God has become a punishment, a bitter draught of shame they are forced to swallow. There could be no more powerful or visceral statement about the utter emptiness, worthlessness, and polluting nature of their idol. Then he turns his fury on his brother. He confronts Aaron. "What did these people do to you, that you led them into such great sin?" It's a pointed question. Moses assumes Aaron must have been provoked or coerced beyond endurance. And Aaron's response is a pathetic, cringeworthy masterclass in shirking responsibility. He whines, "Do not be angry, my Lord." Then he immediately blames the people. "You know how prone these people are to evil." Then he minimizes his own role and describes the event as if he were a passive observer. "They said to me, 'Make us gods who will go before us.' So I told them, 'Whoever has any gold jewelry, take it off.' Then they gave me the gold, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf. It is almost comical in its blatant dishonesty. He presents the creation of the idol as some kind of bizarre, spontaneous miracle. He, the master craftsman who fashioned it with a tool, pretends he had nothing to do with it. The calf just sort of happened. Moses is not amused. He sees that the people are running wild, a phrase that suggests a complete breakdown of moral and social order, and that Aaron had let them get out of control, and so become a laughingstock to their enemies. The sin had to be purged before it destroyed them all. What follows is a grim and violent episode. Moses stands at the entrance to the camp, a place of public judgment, and shouts a challenge. "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." The tribe of Levi, his own tribe, rallies to his side, separating themselves from the chaos. And he gives them a terrible and bloody command to take up their swords, go through the camp from one end to the other, and kill those who were the ringleaders of the rebellion, brother against brother, friend against friend. About 3,000 people die that day. It is a harsh and brutal cleansing, a necessary surgical removal of the cancer of apostasy before it could metastasize and consume the entire nation. It is a terrifying sign of how seriously God takes the sin of idolatry. It is not a harmless difference of opinion or a simple artistic expression. In the context of the covenant, it is high treason against the divine king, and its fruit is chaos and death. The next day, a sobered and grieving Moses addresses the survivors. "You have committed a great sin," he tells them, his voice heavy with sorrow. "But now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin." He prepares to ascend the mountain once more, to go back into the presence of the God his people have so grievously offended. And there, alone again on the holy ground, he prays another prayer of intercession, one even more profound than the first. He doesn't offer excuses. He doesn't blame Aaron or the people's fear. He acknowledges the depth of their sin and then offers the only thing he has left, himself. Oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They have made themselves gods of gold. But now, please forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of the book you have written. It is the ultimate act of a pastoral heart. He is willing to be damned, to have his name erased from God's book of life, if it means his people can be saved. He offers to take their punishment upon himself. It is a stunning act of substitutionary love, a powerful foreshadowing of a future and greater mediator who would one day bear the sins of the world. God does not accept Moses' offer to be blotted out, but he is clearly moved by it. He agrees to forgive the people in the sense that he will not destroy them. He will continue with them on their journey toward the promised land, but a scar remains. The relationship has been deeply damaged. God declares that he will not go up in their midst, for you are a stiff-necked people, and I might destroy you on the way. The intimate, immediate presence of God is withdrawn, to be replaced by the more distant guidance of an angel. The easy, unmediated fellowship that might have been is now gone, a casualty of their faithlessness. The story of the golden calf, then, is the foundational story of Israel's long and painful struggle with idolatry. It happens at the very genesis of their life as a nation, at the very moment they are pledging their troth to their divine husband. It sets the tragic pattern for so much of what is to come. It reveals with stark clarity the deep-seated human desire for a God we can see and manage, the powerful gravitational pull toward the tangible, the visible, and the familiar. It shows how quickly fear can overwhelm faith, and how easily we can forget the most spectacular miracles when faced with uncertainty. The sin wasn't just in the crafting of a metal statue. The sin was in their hearts. It was a failure of memory, forgetting the God who had saved them. It was a failure of trust, refusing to wait for the God who was providing for them. And it was a failure of love, turning their affection from the living Creator to a dead creation. They had been chosen and rescued from slavery by the most powerful being in the universe, who desired a unique, personal, and exclusive relationship with them. And when he simply asked them to wait for him, they panicked and traded him in for a golden cow. It was a tragic, foolish, and deeply human mistake, and it was one they would, unfortunately, spend the next several hundred years repeating in new and ever more heartbreaking ways. If the story of the golden calf was a sudden, violent, and panicked act of infidelity at the very beginning of the marriage, what followed was a much longer, sadder, and more complicated affair. It was a slow drift, a gradual compromise, a centuries-long temptation that Israel, as a nation, seemed utterly incapable of resisting. The lesson learned at the foot of Sinai, sealed in the blood of 3,000 rebels and the bitter water of ground-up gold, was supposed to last forever, and for a time, it seemed like it did. That generation, the generation that had danced around the calf, was condemned to wander and die in the wilderness. It was a 40-year-long reset, a harsh purification process designed to burn the slave mentality and the Egyptian programming out of the nation's soul. A new generation was raised in the desert, a people who had never known Egypt, whose daily bread was manna from heaven, and whose only God was the pillar of cloud and fire that led them. Under the leadership of Joshua, a man of singular and uncompromising faith, this new generation crossed the Jordan River and began the conquest of Canaan. It was a brutal, bloody campaign, but it was framed as a holy war. They were not just claiming territory, they were acting as instruments of God's judgment against the deeply corrupt Canaanite civilizations, and they were commanded to utterly destroy them and their religious sites, to leave no trace of their idolatry. The book of Joshua is a story of victory after victory, of faith and obedience leading to success. Jericho falls. Ai is taken. The Gibeonites are tricked, but the covenant with them is kept. A coalition of southern kings is defeated. A coalition of northern kings is crushed. It seems as though the plan is working. The land is being cleansed. But here is where the slow, creeping tragedy begins. The conquest is incomplete. The book of Joshua itself admits this, listing territories that were not yet taken. The first chapter of the book of Judges makes it even more painfully clear. Tribe by tribe, it lists the peoples the Israelites failed to drive out. The tribe of Judah could not dislodge the Jebusites, who were living in Jerusalem. The tribe of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites. Manasseh did not drive out the people of Beit Shan and other towns. Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites living in Jezer. Zebulun did not. Asher did not. Naphtali did not. The refrain echoes like a funeral bell. They did not drive them out. Instead, they put them to forced labor. They decided to coexist. This was not a failure of military strength. It was a failure of obedience and will. And it was a fatal mistake. They had been warned in the clearest possible terms by Moses before he died. In the book of Deuteronomy, he laid out the choice before them. Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land where you are going, for they will be a snare among you. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and cut down their Asherah poles. Do not worship their gods, for that will be a snare to you. By allowing the Canaanites to remain in the land, the Israelites ensured that their altars, their sacred stones, and their Asherah poles would also remain. They had left the spiritual cancer in the body of the nation. They thought they could manage it, that they could live alongside it without being infected. They were tragically, catastrophically wrong. The snare was set. To understand the sheer magnetic power of this snare, we have to understand the world the Israelites were moving into. Canaan was not a primitive backwater. It was a collection of sophisticated, well-fortified city-states that had existed for centuries. They had advanced metallurgy, impressive architecture, established trade routes, and a deeply entrenched culture. For the Israelites, a nation of former slaves and semi-nomadic shepherds, moving into this world must have felt like moving from a rustic village into a bustling, dazzling metropolis. The Canaanites were the established locals, the Israelites were the immigrants, the newcomers. And the Canaanite religion was not the private affair we might think of today. It was the very operating system of their society, inextricably linked to the economy, the calendar, the weather, and the land itself. Their pantheon was complex, but at the top sat a figure named El. He was the Father God, the patriarch of the divine assembly, depicted as a wise, gray-bearded old king sitting on a throne. He was seen as the ultimate authority, the original creator. But like many supreme deities, he was rather remote, distant, and not terribly involved in the day-to-day affairs of humanity. For the Israelites, the concept of a single, supreme God was not entirely foreign. So El himself was not the primary temptation. The real problem, the God who would become Yahweh's great rival for the heart of Israel, was a younger, more dynamic, and far more exciting deity, Baal. The name Baal simply means Lord or Master, and he was the undisputed star of the Canaanite pantheon. If El was the distant king, Baal was the heroic, active prince, the executive power in the cosmos. He was the storm god, the god of wind, rain, thunder, and lightning. His most common title was the rider on the clouds. Now, you have to place yourself in the mindset of an ancient Near Eastern farmer to grasp the absolute centrality of a god like Baal. Your entire existence, your crops, your livestock, your family's survival depended on the rain, just any rain, but the right amount of rain at the right time. Too little, and your fields would turn to dust, and your children would starve. Too much, and your crops would be washed away in flash floods. The weather was a constant source of life or death anxiety. In the desert, the Israelites had been taught to depend on Yahweh for miraculous provision: manna from the sky, water from a rock. But now they were farmers. They were plowing fields, planting seeds, and anxiously watching the skies. The Canaanites, their new neighbors, had a system for this. They had a god whose entire job description was managing the rain. When the skies were brassy and the earth was cracked and dry, who did you pray to? Did you pray to the invisible god of the desert who had never, as far as you knew, been in charge of agriculture? Or did you hedge your bets and also make a small offering at the local hilltop shrine to Baal, the god everyone around you swore by, the one whose very identity was tied to the life-giving storm? The temptation was not just spiritual, it was intensely practical. To ignore Baal seemed, to the pragmatic mind, like agricultural malpractice. The stories the Canaanites told about Baal, which we know from clay tablets discovered in the ancient city of Ugarit, were epic and compelling. They weren't dry theological treatises. They were action-packed myths that explained the workings of the world. In the great Baal cycle, Baal battles for supremacy against two fearsome rivals. First, he confronts Yam, the tyrannical god of the sea and rivers. Yam is a chaotic, monstrous force, and in a mighty battle, Baal defeats him, establishing order over chaos and confirming his kingship over the gods. This story would have resonated deeply, explaining why the chaotic sea was kept at bay and why the rivers, while useful, were ultimately subservient to the life-giving rain. His second, more formidable opponent was Mo, the god of death and sterility, the lord of the underworld. Mo represented the scorching heat of summer, the season of drought when the vegetation withered and the land seemed to die. In their epic struggle, Mo manages to swallow Baal, and Baal descends into the underworld. With the storm god gone, the earth dries up, life languishes. The gods mourn. But Baal's sister and consort, the fierce warrior goddess Anat, intervenes. She confronts Mo, seizes him, and in a graphic depiction of agricultural processing, she splits him with a sword, winnows him in a sieve, burns him in a fire, and grinds him in a mill, scattering his remains over the fields. Following this, Baal is resurrected. He returns from the underworld, and with his return come the autumn rains, the renewal of life, and the restoration of fertility to the land. This myth was not just entertainment. It was a liturgical drama that mirrored the seasons. The death of Baal was the summer drought. His resurrection was the return of the rainy season. The rituals and festivals dedicated to Baal were designed to participate in this cosmic drama, to ensure that Baal would once again defeat Mo and bring life back to the world. It was a powerful, cyclical, and deeply resonant story for an agricultural people. It made sense of their world. Alongside Baal were powerful female deities, primarily Asherah and Astarte. Asherah was the consort of the high god El, the great mother goddess of She was associated with life, fertility, and wisdom. Her primary symbols were trees, and her worship often took place in sacred groves on hilltops. The infamous Asherah poles, mentioned so often in the Bible, were carved wooden poles, likely representing a stylized sacred tree, that were set up next to altars dedicated to Baal or other gods. They were tangible symbols of her life-giving maternal presence. To worship in a sacred grove, under the shade of ancient trees, would have been a profoundly different sensory experience from the stark, imageless worship of Yahweh. It was earthy, natural, and sensual. Astarte, often called Ashtoreth by the biblical writers, was a more complex and fiery figure. She was the goddess of fertility, but also of sexuality and war. As the goddess of the morning and evening star, the planet Venus, she had celestial connections. Her worship could involve ecstatic rites, and most notoriously, cultic prostitution. At her temples, there would be consecrated men and women with whom worshippers could engage in sexual acts. This was not seen as immoral debauchery. It was a form of sympathetic magic. By engaging in a sacred sexual act at the temple of the fertility goddess, worshippers believed they were magically stimulating the fertility of the land, their livestock, and their own families. Now compare this entire religious system to the demands of Yahweh. Yahweh is a jealous God who demands exclusive worship. The Canaanite system was inclusive. Of course, you could worship Baal for rain, and Astarte for children, and some other god for success in business. Yahweh is invisible and forbids all images. The Canaanite system was vividly visual, with statues, poles, and pillars. Yahweh demands moral holiness and sexual purity. The Canaanite system incorporated sacred prostitution and ecstatic, orgiastic rituals as a central part of its worship. Yahweh's law called for justice for the poor and the marginalized. Canaanite religion was often tied to the power of the king and the elite. For the Israelites, settling down in Canaan after 40 years in the desert, the allure of this vibrant, sensual, and seemingly practical religion must have been overwhelming. It promised everything they wanted: rain for their crops, children for their families, and a good time while they were at it. The worship of Yahweh seemed, by comparison, austere, demanding, and abstract. The snare was perfectly designed to catch them, and so we come to the book of Judges. It is one of the darkest and most disturbing books in the Bible. It chronicles the period after Joshua's death, when there was no central leader, and it describes a nation in a constant, downward spiral of spiritual and moral decay. The book itself gives us the framework, a repeating, tragic cycle that defines the era. Step 1. Apostasy. The people, lulled by a period of peace, would forget the Lord and begin to worship the Baals and the Asherahs of their Canaanite neighbors. They would do evil in the sight of the Lord. Step 2. Oppression. As a consequence of their spiritual adultery, God, their divine husband, would withdraw his protection. He would sell them into the hands of their enemies, the Moabites, the Midianites, the Ammonites, the Philistines, would be raided, plundered, and subjugated. Step 3. Repentance. After years of suffering under foreign oppression, the people would finally cry out to the Lord for deliverance. It was often a cry of pain more than a cry of true repentance. But God, in His mercy, would hear them. Step 4. Deliverance. God would raise up a judge, not a robed magistrate in a courtroom, but a charismatic military leader, a deliverer empowered by the Spirit of the Lord to rescue the people. Step 5. Peace. The judge would lead the people to victory, throwing off the yoke of the oppressor, and the land would have peace for 40 years, or for 80 years, a symbolic period of rest. But then the judge would die, and the people, lacking a righteous leader to guide them, would slide back into idolatry, often doing even more corruptly than their fathers. And the whole miserable cycle would begin again. The book of Judges is the story of this cycle repeating itself over and over, each time with a little more depravity, a little more chaos. The book's sorrowful overture is set at a place they named Bachem, which means weepers. The angel of the Lord comes to the people and delivers a devastating rebuke. He reminds them of the covenant, of how He brought them out of Egypt and swore to give them the land. And then He confronts them with their failure. I told you, do not make a covenant with the people of this land, but break down their altars. Yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? Now therefore I tell you that I will not drive them out before you. They will be thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you. When the people hear this, they finally understand the gravity of their disobedience. The future they have chosen for themselves is one of perpetual conflict and temptation. And they lift up their voices and weep. But their tears are not enough to change their behavior. A generation arises who knew neither the Lord nor what He had done for Israel. And they forsook the God of their fathers and followed the various Baals and Ashtoreths. The first major story of the cycle involves a judge named Othniel, but the book quickly moves to more detailed and dramatic accounts. One of the most telling is the story of Gideon. When we meet Gideon, the cycle is in full swing. For 7 years, the Israelites have been brutally oppressed by the Midianites, nomadic raiders from the eastern desert. The oppression is agricultural. The Midianites would swarm into the land at harvest time as thick as locusts, with their camels without number, and they would devour everything. They stripped the land bare, leaving no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep, nor ox, nor donkey. The Israelites are reduced to hiding in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. And the reason for this devastation is stated plainly. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. They had turned to Baal. So, the God they were worshiping for agricultural prosperity was failing them, and the God they had abandoned was using agricultural disaster to punish them. The Lord decides to raise up a deliverer, but He doesn't find a brave warrior on a battlefield. He finds Gideon, the son of Joash, hiding. He is thrashing wheat, but not on an open thrashing floor where the wind could separate the chaff. He's doing it secretly down inside a winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. He is the perfect picture of his nation, fearful, subjugated, and just trying to survive. The angel of the Lord appears to him and says, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon's response is cynical and dripping with despair. "Pardon me, my Lord, but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." It is the cry of a man whose faith has been crushed by circumstances. He has forgotten that their circumstances are a direct result of their sin. The Lord calls him to be the deliverer, and Gideon, full of doubt, asks for a series of signs, which God patiently provides. But then comes the crucial test. The very first command God gives to Gideon is not to gather an army or to strategize for war. It is a command to commit an act of theological warfare. God tells him, "Take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old. Tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on the top of this height. Using the wood of the Asherah pole, offer the bull as a burnt offering." This command is incredibly radical and dangerous. First, the altar belongs to his own father, Joash. This is an act of rebellion against his family's authority. Second, it is the town's official shrine. He is committing an act of public sacrilege against the God his entire community has adopted. This is not just a private act of faith. It is a direct, public confrontation with the religious and social power structure of his village. The bull is specified as 7 years old, likely mirroring the 7 years of Midianite oppression, a symbol that the time of Baal's dominion is over. And the final instruction is the ultimate insult. He is to use the sacred wood of the mother goddess Asherah as common firewood to fuel a sacrifice to Yahweh. He is to take the symbols of the Canaanite gods and utterly desecrate them, turning them into instruments of worship for the one true God. Gideon is terrified. He knows what the reaction of the townspeople will be, so he doesn't do it in broad daylight. He takes 10 of his servants and carries out the divine vandalism under the cover of night. He is obedient, but his obedience is still tinged with fear. By morning, the deed is done. The altar to Baal is a heap of rubble. The Asherah pole is gone, and in its place stands a new, properly constructed altar to Yahweh, with the ashes of a recent sacrifice still warm upon it. The men of the town are enraged. When they discover that Gideon is the culprit, a lynch mob forms. They storm Josh's house and demand, "Bring out your son. He must die, because he has broken down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it." They are more loyal to their pagan god than to their own kinsmen. Their reaction proves how deeply the cancer of Baal worship has metastasized. But Gideon's father, Joash, has a sudden change of heart, or perhaps a stroke of genius. He stands up to the mob and delivers a brilliant, sarcastic defense. Are you going to plead Baal's case? Are you trying to save him? If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar. He throws the challenge right back at them and their powerless god. Let Baal fight his own battles. From that day on, they called Gideon Jerubbaal, which means "let Baal contend," a name that would forever commemorate his act of defiance. By this one act of iconoclasm, Gideon had exposed Baal as an impotent fraud. He had smashed Baal's altar, and nothing had happened. There was no lightning strike from heaven, no divine retribution. The God of the storm was silent. This theological victory was the necessary prelude to the military victory that would follow. Gideon had to defeat the gods of his own people before he could defeat their foreign enemies. The rest of Gideon's story is famous: the fleece, the trimming of the army from 32,000 down to a mere 300, the brilliant nighttime raid with the trumpets, torches, and jars that threw the vast Midianite camp into a panic. He secures a magnificent victory and brings peace to the land. But the story doesn't end there. The pull of idolatry is subtle and persistent. The grateful Israelites come to Gideon and offer him and his family a hereditary monarchy. Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian. Gideon gives them a pious-sounding refusal. I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. But then, in the very next breath, he makes a request. I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder. He collects a massive amount of gold, and with it, he makes a golden ephod, a priestly garment. Why he does this is unclear, perhaps as a personal memorial to his victory. But the effect is disastrous. The Bible tells us that all Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. He had torn down the altar to Baal, only to set up a new object of worship that led the people right back into idolatry. The impulse to create a visible, tangible religious object, the same impulse that led to the golden calf, was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. Gideon, the great judge who began his career by destroying an idol, ends it by creating one. The final, tragic postscript to Gideon's life is his son, Abimelech. His mother was a Canaanite concubine from Shechem, a city with a great temple to a god called Baal-berith, which means Lord of the Covenant, a blasphemous appropriation of a sacred Israelite concept. Abimelech, whose name means "my father is king," conspires with his mother's Canaanite relatives, murders all 70 of his half-brothers, and has himself crowned king in Shechem. The slide from Yahwism to Baalism to a pagan-style monarchy built on fratricide is swift and brutal. The era of the Judges is not just a story of external enemies, but of deep internal rot. This pattern of syncretism and apostasy continues through the stories of the other judges. Jephthah, a judge from the lawless region of Gilead, makes a rash vow to Yahweh that sounds much more like a pagan bargain with a god like Chemosh, and it results in the sacrifice of his own daughter. The final judge in the book, and the most famous, is Samson. His story is not explicitly about Baal worship, but it is a powerful allegory for the entire period. Samson is born to be a Nazirite, a man consecrated and set apart for God from birth. He is not to drink wine, not to touch touch a dead body and never to cut his hair. He is meant to be a living symbol of Israel's holy calling, their separation from the surrounding pagan cultures. And he is endowed with superhuman strength, a direct gift from the Spirit of the Lord. His mission is to begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines. The Philistines were a new and formidable enemy, a technologically advanced seafaring people who had settled on the coastal plain. Their chief god was Dagon, a deity associated with grain and agriculture. But Samson, the man who is supposed to be separate, is constantly drawn to the very culture he is meant to fight. His entire story is driven by his lust for Philistine women. First, a woman from Timnah, then a prostitute in Gaza, and finally, the infamous Delilah from the valley of Sorek. He is constantly breaking his Nazirite vows. He touches the carcass of a lion. He throws a massive feast with wine. He is a man at war with himself, his divine calling in conflict with his fleshly appetites. He is a perfect metaphor for the nation of Israel, divinely chosen and gifted, but fatally attracted to the pagan world, constantly compromising its holy calling for the sake of fleshly desires. His strength is not his own. It is a sign of God's presence, but he treats it like his own possession, using it for personal vendettas and childish pranks. When he finally reveals the secret of his strength to Delilah, and she has his hair cut as he sleeps, the text says something truly heartbreaking. He awoke from his sleep and thought, "I'll go out as before and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. His strength is gone because God's presence is gone. He is captured, blinded, and reduced to grinding grain in a prison. The ultimate humiliation for Israel's mighty hero. The final scene of Samson's life takes place in the great temple of Dagon in Gaza. The Philistine rulers have gathered for a massive festival to celebrate their victory, and they offer a great sacrifice to their god. They declare, "Our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, the one who laid waste our land and multiplied our slain." They explicitly credit their idol Dagon with the defeat of Yahweh's champion. To mock both Samson and his God, they bring the blind hero out to entertain the cheering crowds. Samson, humbled and broken, prays one last time. It is not a selfless prayer, but it is a prayer of faith. "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." He places his hands on the 2 central pillars supporting the temple roof, and with a final surge of God-given strength, he pushes. The temple comes crashing down, killing him and more people than he had killed in his entire life. In his death, Samson achieves his greatest victory. But more importantly, it is Yahweh's victory. The temple of Dagon is destroyed, the Philistine leadership is wiped out, and the claim that Dagon was superior to Yahweh is answered with a final, thunderous no. The book of Judges ends with 2 horrifying appendices that illustrate the absolute moral and spiritual chaos of the period. One tells the story of a man named Micah who steals silver from his mother, then gives it back, and she has it made into a household idol, he hires a wandering Levite to be his personal priest, creating his own private, syncretistic cult. This private idolatry soon becomes tribal idolatry when the entire tribe of Dan, seeking new territory, steals Micah's idols and his priest and sets them up as their official religion in their new home. The other story is a sickening tale of gang rape, murder, and a brutal civil war that nearly wipes out the entire tribe of Benjamin. The book concludes with one of the most haunting refrains in all of Scripture, a phrase that perfectly summarizes the entire era. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. Without a righteous king, either human or divine, to guide them, the nation had disintegrated into a lawless collection of tribes, each pursuing its own selfish and often idolatrous desires. The experiment in being a loose confederation of tribes united only by their covenant with Yahweh had been a spectacular failure. The lure of the Canaanite gods, with their promises of agricultural prosperity and their sensual rituals, had proven too powerful. The Israelites had failed to be holy, failed to be separate, and as a result, they had failed to find peace or security. They had become just another one of the nations, and a particularly miserable one at that. The thorns the Canaanites were meant to be had pierced their sides, and the snare of their gods had well and truly caught them. The stage was set for a new chapter, a new experiment in the life of the nation. The demand for a king, the final haunting words of the book of Judges, hang in the air like a death sentence. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. It's an epitaph for an era of chaos, a 400-year-long fever dream of apostasy, violence, and despair. The great experiment of being a loose tribal confederation, united only by a covenant with an invisible king, had failed spectacularly. The people, it turned out, were not spiritually mature enough to handle that kind of freedom. Left to their own devices, they did not incline towards holiness and justice. They inclined towards the altars of Baal, the poles of Asherah, and the deepest, darkest pits of their own depravity. The solution seemed obvious, at least to them. If the problem was a lack of a king, then the solution was to get one. This desire crystallizes in the lifetime of Samuel, the last of the great judges, and the first of the great prophets. He was a man who had governed Israel faithfully for decades, a bridge between the old era and the new. But as he grew old, his sons, whom he had appointed as judges, proved to be corrupt, accepting bribes and perverting justice. The people saw in his sons' failure a glimpse of the old chaos returning, and it terrified them. The elders of Israel gathered and came to Samuel with a formal demand, a demand that would change the course of their history forever. You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. On the surface, it sounds like a reasonable, pragmatic request. They wanted stability. They wanted a central government, a standing army, a leader who could unite the tribes and defend them from the ever-present threat of the Philistines. But Samuel, and more importantly, God, heard something else beneath the practical request. They heard a profound spiritual rejection. When a heartbroken Samuel prayed to the Lord, the response was sharp and clear. Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. Their desire for a king, such as all the other nations have, was the very heart of the problem. From the beginning, Israel was called to be different. They were to be a holy nation, a peculiar people, a kingdom of priests whose king was God himself. Their uniqueness was their glory. Now, they were tired of being unique. They wanted to be normal. They looked at the Philistines with their kings, the Moabites with their king, the Egyptians with their divine Pharaoh, and they felt a sense of national inferiority. They wanted the pomp, the power, and the visible authority of a human monarch. In a tragic way, their demand for a king was a sophisticated political version of their ancestors' demand for a golden calf. They were once again rejecting the rule of the invisible God in favor of a tangible, visible ruler they could see and touch and follow into battle. It was a form of idolatry, a placing of their ultimate trust and security in a human institution rather than in God himself. God instructs Samuel to grant their request, but first, to give them a solemn warning about what life under a human king would actually be like. Samuel's speech is a chilling prophecy of the costs of monarchy. He tells them, "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." It is a stark warning. The king who is meant to save them will, in fact, enslave them through conscription, taxation, and expropriation of their land. He will take and take and take, but the people are stubborn. Their minds are made up. "No," they said, "we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles." They wanted a king to fight their battles, forgetting that God had always been the one to fight their battles for them. And so, God gave them what they wanted. Their first king, Saul, was exactly what they had asked for. He looked the part. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, tall and handsome, standing a head taller than anyone else. He was a man of action, a charismatic military leader who won decisive victories against the Ammonites and the Philistines. But Saul's reign was a false start, a demonstration of the spiritual perils of kingship. His great sin was not the worship of Baal or Asherah. It was a more subtle, but equally corrosive form of idolatry. The idolatry of self, the worship of public opinion, and the elevation of his own will above the clear command of God. In a key incident, before a crucial battle with the Philistines, Saul and his army were waiting for Samuel to come and offer the proper sacrifices. But Samuel was delayed, and Saul saw his soldiers, terrified of the massive Philistine army, beginning to desert. Panicked at the thought of losing his army and the approval of his men, he took matters into his own hands. Though he was not a priest, he performed the burnt offering himself. It was an act of religious presumption born of fear and a desire to control the situation. When Samuel arrived, his rebuke was severe. "You have done a foolish thing. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. Your kingdom will not endure." Saul's second great failure was even more direct. God commanded him, through Samuel, to carry out a sentence of judgment against the Amalekites, to utterly destroy them and all their possessions. But Saul, again swayed by the desire for popular approval and personal gain, spared the Amalekite king Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle. When Samuel confronted him, Saul's excuse was pious sounding. The soldiers spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God. Samuel's reply is one of the most powerful statements in the Old Testament. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Saul's arrogance, his belief that he knew better than God, was a form of idolatry. He had rejected the word of the Lord, and so the Lord had rejected him as king. Saul's reign ended in tragedy, paranoia, and suicide on the battlefield. But God had already chosen his replacement, a man who would become the standard, the template against which all future kings of Israel would be measured. This was David, the shepherd boy from Bethlehem. David was not chosen because he was perfect. His life would be scarred by terrible sins of adultery, deception, and murder. He was chosen because, as the scripture says, he was a man after God's own heart. This didn't mean he was sinless. It meant that the fundamental orientation of his heart, his deepest desire and loyalty, was directed toward Yahweh. When he sinned, he repented with a broken and contrite heart. When he succeeded, he gave all the glory to God. David's reign represents a brief, shining golden age in the spiritual life of Israel. He was the antithesis of the kings who would follow. He actively sought to stamp out the remnants of Canaanite worship in the land. His greatest act was the conquest of Jerusalem, the Jebusite stronghold that the tribes had failed to take for centuries. He made it his political capital, the city of David. But more importantly, he made it the nation's spiritual capital. He brought the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred symbol of God's presence that had been neglected for decades, into Jerusalem with exuberant, undignified joy, dancing before the Lord with all his might. He centralized the worship of Yahweh in one place, laying the groundwork for the future temple. He organized the priesthood and the Levites, established choirs, and wrote many of the Psalms that would become the prayer book of the nation. Under David, there was no question of who was God in Israel. The worship of Baal and Asherah was driven underground, and the nation was, for a time, united in its devotion to the Lord. He was the king they should have wanted all along. Not just a king to fight their battles, but a king who would lead them in worshiping the God who truly fought their battles for them. David wanted to build a permanent house for God, a magnificent temple to replace the aging tabernacle. But God, through the prophet Nathan, told him no. David was a man of war, his hands stained with too much blood. The task of building the temple would fall to his son, a man of peace. And this son was Solomon. Solomon's reign began with incredible promise. When God appeared to him in a dream and offered him anything he wanted, Solomon, in an act of profound humility, did not ask for wealth or long life or victory over his enemies. He asked for wisdom. Give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. This request pleased God so much that he gave Solomon not only unparalleled wisdom, but also the wealth and honor he had not asked for. The early years of Solomon's reign were the absolute zenith of Israel's power, prosperity, and international prestige. And the crowning achievement of this era was the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem. It was one of the wonders of the ancient world. For 7 years, the finest materials and the most skilled artisans were dedicated to its construction. Giant cedars from the forests of Lebanon, massive blocks of quarried stone, and gold, tons and tons of gold, were used to create a breathtakingly beautiful house for the Lord. The inner sanctuary, the most holy place, was overlaid entirely with pure gold. The walls were carved with cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. 2 enormous, gold-covered cherubim, their wings stretching from wall to wall, guarded the space where the Ark of the Covenant would rest. This temple was a monumental act of national devotion, a permanent, glorious statement that Yahweh alone was God in Israel. At the dedication ceremony, Solomon prayed a magnificent prayer of dedication, and the glory of the Lord, the same fiery cloud that had filled the tabernacle in the wilderness, filled the temple so that the priests could not even stand to minister. It was the high water mark of Israel's history, and it is from this glorious peak that the fall becomes so tragic, so shocking, and so complete. The seed of Solomon's downfall was sown in the very source of his international success, his political alliances, which he sealed through marriage. The king who had asked only for wisdom developed an insatiable appetite for the trappings of a great international monarch: wealth, horses, and women. He violated every one of the specific prohibitions for a king laid out in the law of Moses, and his collection of women was staggering. The Bible states he had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. This was not about romance. It was about statecraft. He married daughters of pharaohs, princesses from Moab, Ammon, Edom, and Sidon, forging treaties and securing trade routes with their families. It was a pragmatic, savvy, and typically kingly thing to do. It was also a direct and catastrophic act of disobedience. God had explicitly forbidden intermarriage with these nations, for they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. And that is exactly what happened. The text of 1 Kings chapter 11 is one of the saddest in the Bible. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. The slow, insidious creep of compromise had finally broken him. The wisest man in the world made the most foolish of choices, and this was not a passive, private apostasy. Solomon, the builder of God's temple, became an active, state-sponsored patron of paganism. He didn't just allow his foreign wives to worship their own gods in the privacy of the palace. He facilitated and funded their cults on a massive public scale. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. Take a moment to absorb the full horror of that statement. On the Mount of Olives, a hill directly opposite the Temple Mount, in full view of the magnificent house of the Lord, the King of Israel himself constructed and dedicated official shrines to the most abhorrent deities of the ancient world. Chemosh was a national god who, like Molech, was sometimes appeased with the horror of child sacrifice. Every morning, as the sun rose in the east, the priests in the temple of Yahweh would look out and see the smoke rising from the altars of pagan gods, built and sanctioned by their own king. Idolatry was no longer a grassroots problem bubbling up from the unfaithful populace, as it had been in the time of the judges. It was now official state policy, endorsed and institutionalized from the very top. The great international unifier had become the great national idolater. The builder of the temple had become the builder of high places. The judgment of God was swift and decisive. Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. For the sake of his father David, God would not do it in Solomon's lifetime, and he would leave one tribe, Judah, for his descendants to rule. But the unified kingdom, the great empire of David and Solomon, was now doomed. The seeds of division and civil war were sown in the soil of Solomon's apostasy. The nation that had rejected God as their king in favor of a human king was now going to be torn apart, because that human king had rejected God in favor of the gods of his foreign wives. After Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam took the throne. He was an arrogant and foolish leader who rejected the wise counsel of his elders and promised to rule the people with even greater harshness than his father. This was the final straw for the northern tribes. 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel seceded, forming a new kingdom in the north, which retained the name Israel. The tribes of Judah and Benjamin in the south remained loyal to the house of David, and their kingdom became known as Judah. The glorious unified monarchy was shattered, just as God had promised. The first king of the new northern kingdom of Israel was a man named Jeroboam, a former official of Solomon's. He was a capable and energetic leader, but he immediately faced a critical political and religious problem. The religious heart of the nation was still the temple in Jerusalem, which was now the capital city of his enemy, the southern kingdom of Judah. According to the law of Moses, all Israelite men were required to travel to the temple 3 times a year for the major pilgrimage festivals. Jeroboam became paranoid. He thought, if these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. His fear for his own political security drove him to commit an act of spiritual treason that would define and condemn the northern kingdom for the rest of its existence. He reasoned that he needed to provide his people with an alternative, a state religion that would keep them from going to Jerusalem. So he took counsel, and he came up with a solution that was a direct, horrifying echo of the sin at the foot of Mount Sinai. He had 2 golden calves made. He set one up at Bethel, a historically sacred site at the southern end of his kingdom, right on the border with Judah. He set the other up at Dan, in the far north of his kingdom. He then stood before the people and made a proclamation that should send a shiver down the spine of anyone who remembers the story of Exodus. It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. It was the original sin, replayed and institutionalized. Just like Aaron, Jeroboam likely didn't see this as a complete rejection of Yahweh. It was a corrupted, syncretistic form of Yahweh worship. The calves were probably intended to be pedestals or thrones upon which the invisible Yahweh was meant to ride, a common depiction for gods in the ancient Near East. But in creating a visual object of worship, in violating the second commandment so flagrantly, he had opened the door to every kind of paganism. To complete his religious revolution, he built shrines on high places, appointed priests from any tribe, not just the Levites, and he even instituted his own religious festival in the 8th month, a counterfeit version of the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem. This became known as the sin of Jeroboam son of Nebat, which he caused Israel to commit. Every single one of the 19 kings who would follow him in the northern kingdom would continue in this sin. The kingdom of Israel was born in idolatry, and it would be defined by it until its dying day. For the next century and a half, the northern kingdom lurched from one corrupt king to another, sinking deeper and deeper into idolatry. But the absolute nadir, the darkest point in this downward spiral, came with the reign of the 7th king of Israel, Ahab. Ahab was not necessarily a weak king politically or militarily. He was a powerful builder and a formidable commander. But the scripture gives this damning verdict. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. What made Ahab so uniquely evil was not just his continuation of the golden calf cult of Jeroboam. He took Israel's apostasy to a whole new level. as if Jeroboam's sin were a trivial thing, the Bible says, Ahab forged a political alliance with the powerful Phoenician city of Tyre by marrying its princess, a woman named Jezebel. Jezebel was not like Solomon's foreign wives, who simply wanted a place to worship their own gods. She was the daughter of the king and high priest of Tyre, a fanatical, zealous devotee of her national god, Baal-Melkart. And she came to Israel not just as a queen, but as a missionary. Her explicit goal was to eradicate the worship of Yahweh and make the worship of Baal the official state religion of Israel. She was intelligent, ruthless, and utterly devoted to her cause. With Ahab's full support, she launched an aggressive, state-sponsored campaign. She persuaded Ahab to build a massive, magnificent temple to Baal in the newly built capital city of Samaria, complete with its own altar and Asherah pole. She established a huge retinue of pagan clergy, supporting 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah at the royal table, paid for by the state treasury, and she began a violent, systematic persecution to eliminate her rival religion. She launched the first great inquisition in biblical history, hunting down and murdering the prophets of the Lord wherever she could find them. The worship of Yahweh, which had already been corrupted by the golden calves, was now in danger of being extinguished entirely in the northern kingdom. It was the darkest moment yet, and it is into this profound darkness that one of the most dramatic and powerful figures in the entire Old Testament strides onto the stage. His name is Elijah. We are told nothing of his background, only that he is Elijah the Tishbite, a rugged, hairy man from the wild backwoods of Gilead, clad in leather. He is the antithesis of the decadent, sophisticated pagan court of Ahab and Jezebel. He simply appears before King Ahab and delivers a stunning proclamation, a direct challenge to Jezebel's God. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word. This was not just a weather forecast. It was a declaration of war. In a land where everyone believed Baal was the Lord of the storm and the giver of rain, the prophet of the invisible God Yahweh declared that he, and he alone, now controlled the rain. He had seized control of the very portfolio that supposedly belonged to Baal. And then he vanished. For 3.5 years, a devastating drought and famine gripped the land. The heavens were shut, the streams dried up, the crops failed, and the people suffered. Every cloudless day was a testament to the impotence of Baal and the power of Yahweh. After 3.5 years, God sends Elijah back to confront Ahab. The king, haggard and desperate, greets him with an accusation. "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" Elijah's reply is fearless. "I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals." And then he lays down the terms for the ultimate showdown, a national contest to determine, once and for all, who is the true God. "Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel." And bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table. Mount Carmel was a strategic choice. It was a high mountain ridge overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, a place historically associated with the worship of Baal, a natural high place. Ahab, desperate for rain, agrees to the contest. The stage is set for one of the most dramatic confrontations in all of literature. Imagine the scene: the parched, brown landscape, the huge, anxious crowd of Israelites who have gathered to watch. On one side, arrayed in their priestly vestments, are the 450 prophets of Baal, confident in their numbers and their royal patronage. On the other side stands a single, rough-hewn figure, Elijah, the lone prophet of God. Elijah first addresses the crowd, the people who have been trying to have it both ways, worshiping Yahweh when it was convenient and Baal when they needed rain. His question cuts to the very heart of their spiritual compromise. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. The people, ashamed and uncertain, remain silent. So Elijah proposes the test. 2 bulls are to be prepared for sacrifice, one for Baal and one for the Lord. They are to be cut into pieces and laid on the wood of 2 separate altars, but no fire is to be lit. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God. The terms are simple, spectacular, and undeniable. The people agree that this is a fair test. The prophets of Baal go first. They prepare their bull and begin to call on the name of Baal. From morning until noon, they cry out, "Baal, answer us." But there is no response, only an eerie silence from the brassy, cloudless sky. They begin to perform their ritualistic dance, limping and gimping around the altar. As noon approaches, Elijah begins to mock them with savage, sarcastic taunts. "Shout louder," he says. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or he is relieving himself, or he is away on a journey. Perhaps he is sleeping and must be awakened. His mockery is designed to expose the absurdity of their belief in a God who has human limitations. Goaded by his taunts and growing more desperate, the prophets of Baal work themselves into a frenzy. They shout louder and begin to slash themselves with swords and spears, according to their religious custom, until their blood flows freely. They continue their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice, but still there is nothing. No response, no one answered, no one paid attention. The first half of the contest is over. Baal is officially a no-show. Then it is Elijah's turn. His actions are slow, deliberate, and full of symbolic meaning. First, he calls the people to come near to him. Then he repairs the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. He takes 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel, a powerful reminder of their broken unity and their common identity as the people of Yahweh. He digs a trench around the altar. He arranges the wood, cuts the bull into pieces, and lays it on the wood. Then he does something that seems completely insane in the middle of a 3-year drought. He commands the people, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood. They do it once. Do it again, he says. They do it a second time. Do it a third time, he commands. They do it a third time, until the sacrifice and the wood are completely saturated, and the water fills the trench around the altar. There can be no question of trickery, no possibility of a hidden fire. He has made the test impossibly hard. Then, as the sun begins to set, at the time of the evening sacrifice in the temple in Jerusalem, Elijah steps forward and prays. His prayer is not a frantic shout or a wild incantation. It is a simple, clear, and powerful appeal to God. Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. His prayer is not for his own vindication, but for God's glory and for the restoration of the people. The response is instantaneous and overwhelming. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. This is no ordinary fire. It is a supernatural conflagration, a bolt of divine energy from heaven that consumes everything: the waterlogged sacrifice, the wood, the massive stones of the altar, and even the very dust beneath it. The demonstration of power is absolute, terrifying, and undeniable. The reaction of the people is one of primal terror and sudden, profound belief. They fall prostrate on the ground, their faces in the dust, and a single, unified cry rises from the crowd. The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. In that one moment, the theological question is settled. The wavering is over. Elijah, now in complete command, gives a grim order. Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let one of them get away. The people, their loyalty instantly transferred. Seize the false prophets. And Elijah takes them down to the Kishon Valley and slaughters them. The pagan clergy that had poisoned the nation is purged. Immediately after this act of judgment, Elijah tells Ahab to go eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain. Elijah climbs to the top of Carmel, crouches down to the ground, and puts his face between his knees in a posture of intense prayer. He sends his servant 7 times to look toward the sea. Finally, on the 7th time, the servant reports seeing a small cloud, as small as a man's hand, rising from the sea. That is all the sign Elijah needs. The drought is broken. A mighty rainstorm follows, and the land is refreshed. The God who answers by fire has also proven that He is the true rider on the clouds, the only one who gives and withholds the rain. It was a total victory, but even this spectacular, undeniable victory was not the end of the story. The monarchy, which the people had demanded to save them from the chaos of the judges' period, had proven to be an even greater spiritual danger. For when a simple farmer like Gideon's father set up an altar to Baal, he might lead a village astray. But when a king like Solomon or a queen like Jezebel institutionalized idolatry, they could corrupt and condemn an entire nation. The showdown on Mount Carmel was a glorious, fiery rebuttal to to the claims of Baal, but the heart of the people and the hearts of their rulers remained stubbornly prone to wander. The war for the soul of Israel was far from over. The fire that fell on Mount Carmel should have been the end of the story. It was the perfect demonstration, a divine mic drop of such spectacular and terrifying finality that it should have cauterized the spiritual sickness of Israel forever. The people saw it. They fell on their faces. They declared, "The Lord, He is God." The prophets of Baal were executed, the land was purged, and the rain returned as a sign of Yahweh's restored favor. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though the war was won. But a spectacular victory on one battlefield does not end a war, especially when the enemy is not an external army, but a deeply rooted corruption within your own heart. The story of what happened next is a tragic lesson in the persistence of unbelief and the stubborn resilience of idolatry. Elijah's victory lap was short-lived. When King Ahab reported the day's events to his wife, Queen Jezebel, the dead prophets, the fire, the rain, she was not converted. She was not even cowed. She was incandescent with rage. The slaughter of her clergy was not, to her, a divine judgment. It was a massacre, an act of war by her religious rival. She immediately sent a messenger to Elijah with a chillingly personal threat. "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." It was a sworn oath. She was putting a 24-hour death warrant on the prophet of God. And Elijah, the man who had just stood alone against 450 false prophets, the man who had called down fire from heaven and stared down a king, did something utterly, shockingly human. He panicked. The Bible says Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. This single, terrifying woman, the embodiment of institutionalized, state-sponsored paganism, proved to be a more formidable opponent than her entire clergy. She could not be defeated by a single miracle because her power was not in her theology, but in the political and military apparatus of the state. Elijah fled south, out of Israel, into the kingdom of Judah, and then further still, deep into the desert, until he collapsed under a broom tree, utterly spent and suicidal. "I have had enough, Lord," he prayed. "Take my life." This is the immediate aftermath of the greatest miracle of his career: burnout, terror, and despair. It's a powerful testament to the fact that even the most spectacular spiritual victories do not magically solve deep-seated systemic problems. Baal worship was not just a theological error. It was the official policy of a ruthless regime, and it would not be dislodged by a single pillar of fire. The fight against Baalism in the northern kingdom would continue, a grim and bloody affair. Elijah would eventually pass his mantle to his successor, Elisha, and Elisha would anoint a military commander named Jehu to be the instrument of God's judgment against the house of Ahab. Jehu's revolution was a whirlwind of violence. He assassinated Ahab's son, King Joram. He had Queen Jezebel thrown from a window, where her body was trampled by horses and devoured by dogs, a shockingly graphic fulfillment of Elijah's prophecy. He then engineered a bloody purge, tricking all the remaining priests and worshippers of Baal in the kingdom into gathering at the great temple of Baal in Samaria for a fake festival. Once they were all inside, he had the doors barred and sent in his soldiers to slaughter every last one of them. He then demolished the temple, tore down its sacred pillar, and turned the site into a public latrine, an act of ultimate desecration. It was a thorough and brutal extermination of the cult of Baal from Israel, and God commended him for it. But Jehu's purge was incomplete. His motives were more political than pious. While he had eradicated the foreign Phoenician cult of Baal, the Bible gives this crucial, damning addendum. However, he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit, the worship of the golden calves at Bethel and Dan. Jehu had destroyed the rival franchise, but he kept the state-sanctioned brand of idolatry that had been started by Jeroboam. The golden calves, the counterfeit priesthood, the illegitimate festivals, this syncretistic, Yahweh but with idols religion, was too politically useful for him to abolish. He had cut down the branches of apostasy, but he had left the root firmly in the ground. And so, for the next century, the northern kingdom continued its slow, inexorable decline, weighed down by the sin of Jeroboam, until the rising superpower of Assyria came down like a wolf on the fold. In 722 BC, the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom, destroyed its capital Samaria, and deported its leading citizens, scattering them across their vast empire. The 10 northern tribes of Israel vanished from history, absorbed and assimilated by the surrounding pagan cultures. Their failure to maintain covenant faithfulness, their centuries-long flirtation, and eventual marriage with idolatry had ended in national annihilation, just as Moses had warned it would 800 years earlier. With the northern kingdom gone, all hopes for the future of God's covenant people now rested on the small, beleaguered southern kingdom of Judah. Judah had always been a little different. It had 2 distinct advantages that the north lacked. First, it was ruled by the Davidic dynasty, a single, unbroken line of kings descended from David, which gave it a measure of political stability. Second, and far more importantly, it possessed Jerusalem and the Temple of Solomon, the one and only place on earth where God had chosen to place his name. This gave Judah a powerful theological anchor, a constant physical reminder of the true worship of Yahweh. But an anchor is only useful if you hold on to it, and Judah's history was a volatile, pendulum-like swing between periods of righteous reform and shocking descents into apostasy. While the north was a consistent, flat line of idolatry, Judah was a dramatic EKG, with soaring peaks of faithfulness and terrifying troughs of paganism. There were moments of incredible light. A king like Hezekiah would come to the throne and institute a sweeping religious reformation. He reopened the doors of the temple, which had been shut by his wicked father Ahaz. He cleansed it of its impurities, reinstated the priests and Levites, and celebrated a magnificent Passover festival, the likes of which had not been seen since the time of Solomon. He then took his reforms to the countryside, launching a national campaign of iconoclasm. The Bible says, he removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. He even destroyed the bronze serpent that Moses had made in the wilderness, because over the centuries, the people had turned it into an idol and were burning incense to it. Hezekiah's reign was a powerful demonstration that revival was possible. Over a century later, his great-grandson Josiah would lead an even more dramatic reformation. During renovations of the temple, which had once again fallen into disrepair, the high priest Hilkiah discovered a lost copy of the Book of the Law, likely the Book of Deuteronomy. When the book was read to the young King Josiah, he tore his robes in anguish, realizing just how far the nation had strayed from God's commands and how severe the curses for disobedience were. He then launched the most thorough purification campaign in Judah's history. He systematically purged the temple of every last pagan object. He gathered all the paraphernalia of Baal, Asherah, and the starry hosts, and burned them outside Jerusalem in the Kidron Valley. He desecrated the high places, slaughtered the pagan priests, and even traveled north to the site of Jeroboam's old altar at Bethel and destroyed it, fulfilling a prophecy made 300 years earlier. He called the entire nation to renew their covenant with the Lord and celebrated a Passover that surpassed even Hezekiah's. For a moment, it seemed as though the nation had truly turned back to God, that the tide of apostasy had been turned back for good. But these revivals, as powerful as they were, could not ultimately change the deep-seated inclination of the people's hearts. The reforms were often top-down, dependent on the piety of the king. As soon as a righteous king died, the pendulum would swing violently back in the other direction. And in the long reign that fell between Hezekiah and Josiah, Judah swung to the lowest, darkest, most depraved point in its entire history. This was the reign of King Manasseh, Hezekiah's son. His 55-year rule stands as a monument to the terrifying possibilities of institutionalized evil. If Ahab was the worst king of Israel, Manasseh was his even more wicked counterpart in Judah. The Bible describes his sins with a kind of breathless horror, piling detail upon detail to paint a portrait of a man who did not just tolerate idolatry, but who seemed to revel in it with a fanatical, almost artistic devotion. His reign was a systematic and contemptuous undoing of every single reform his righteous father had instituted. The first thing the text tells us is that he rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah had destroyed. This was not an act of negligence. It was an act of open defiance, a deliberate declaration that his father's God was not his God. He then went further, importing the worst practices of the fallen northern kingdom. He also erected altars to Baal and made an Asherah pole, as Ahab, king of Israel, had done. He looked at the history of Ahab and Jezebel, the dynasty that God had so spectacularly judged, and he chose to emulate it. But Manasseh was not content to simply reintroduce the old Canaanite fertility cults. He was an innovator of apostasy. He opened Judah up to the new religious superpower of the day, Assyria. The Assyrians worshipped the stars, and Manasseh bowed down to all the starry hosts and worshipped them. This was a new and insidious layer of idolatry, introducing astrology, divination, and fatalism into the spiritual life of Judah. It was a religion that sought to read the future in the patterns of the heavens, a direct rejection of trusting in the providence of the God who created the heavens. Then Manasseh committed the ultimate act of sacrilege, the most profound desecration imaginable. He brought his idols into the very house of the Lord. The text says he built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, "In Jerusalem I will put my name." In the two courts of the Lord's temple, he built altars to all the starry hosts. Imagine the scene. The temple, the place of God's holy, glorious presence, was now cluttered with pagan altars. Worshippers coming to offer their sacrifices to Yahweh had to walk past shrines dedicated to the sun, moon, and stars. But he wasn't finished. He took the Asherah pole he had made, the carved wooden symbol of the Canaanite mother goddess, and he set it up inside the temple. He placed a symbol of female fertility, a goddess of nature and sensuality, in the very sanctuary dedicated to the holy, transcendent, invisible God of the covenant. It was the theological equivalent of spitting in God's face. It was a declaration that Yahweh was just one God among many, and that his own house could be shared with his rivals. Manasseh also delved into the dark arts of sorcery and witchcraft. He practiced divination, sought omens, and consulted mediums and spiritists. He did everything in his power to subvert the authority of God and seek knowledge and power from forbidden demonic sources. But the final and most horrifying line in the indictment against him is this: he sacrificed his own son in the fire. This is the grim practice of child sacrifice, a ritual associated with the Ammonite god Melech, whose name is likely a deliberate Hebrew distortion of the word Melech, meaning king. This was not just another form of idolatry. It was the absolute antithesis of the religion of Yahweh. The God of Israel was the God of life, the one who had commanded his people to be fruitful and multiply. He was the God who had provided a ram as a substitute for Isaac on Mount Moriah, demonstrating his rejection of human sacrifice. To worship Melech was to turn this on its head. It was to serve a God who demanded not the fruit of your fields or your flocks, but the fruit of your womb. The rituals took place in the Valley of Hinnom, a ravine that ran just south of the city of Jerusalem, in a place called Topheth, which means place of fire. There, in that dark valley, in full view of the holy city, the king of Judah took his own son, his heir, and passed him through the fire as an offering to a pagan demon god. It is almost impossible for us to comprehend the spiritual desperation and depravity that would lead a father to do this. It was likely a desperate attempt to gain divine favor in a time of crisis, the ultimate sacrifice to appease an angry God. But it was the ultimate act of rebellion, the ultimate betrayal of the covenant. It was the poisoning of the future to pay for the present. And it was not just the king. The text says Manasseh led Judah and the people of Jerusalem astray, so that they did more evil than the nations the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites. He had dragged his entire nation down into this pit of depravity with him. The text adds one final, chilling detail. He also shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from end to end. The verdict of God, delivered by his prophets, was absolute and irrevocable. Because of the abominations of Manasseh, the fate of Jerusalem and Judah was sealed. I am going to bring such disaster on Jerusalem and Judah that the ears of everyone who hears of it will tingle. I will wipe out Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. I will forsake the remnant of my inheritance and give them into the hands of their enemies. The sin had reached a tipping point. The shedding of innocent blood, especially the blood of children offered to idols, had polluted the land so profoundly that it had to be cleansed by the fire of judgment. Even the great, sweeping reforms of the next king, Josiah, could not turn back the divine decree. The text says that despite Josiah's righteousness, the Lord did not turn away from the heat of his great anger, which burned against Judah, because of all that Manasseh had done to arouse his anger. The die was cast. The end was coming. It was into this atmosphere of impending doom that God raised up his final great prophet to the kingdom of Judah. His name was Jeremiah. If Elijah was a prophet of fire, Jeremiah was a prophet of tears. His entire prophetic book is an agonizing, heartbreaking account of a man forced to pronounce a sentence of death upon the people and the city that he loved. His ministry was a 40-year-long, desperate, last-ditch effort to call a completely deaf and rebellious people back to God. A people who were not just sinning, but who were actively celebrating their sin. Jeremiah's prophecies are a masterclass in diagnosing the pathology of idolatry. He uses the powerful metaphor of spiritual adultery to describe Judah's relationship with God. He pictures God as the faithful, loving husband who had redeemed his bride, Israel, from slavery and entered into a marriage covenant with her at Sinai. But she has been pathologically unfaithful. You have played the harlot with many lovers, God says through the prophet. On every high hill and under every spreading tree you lay down as a prostitute. The worship of Baal and Asherah on the high places was not just a theological mistake. It was an act of infidelity, a betrayal of the deepest intimacy. Jeremiah also powerfully exposes the sheer stupidity and irrationality of idolatry. In one famous passage, he laments, "My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug for themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water." God is the ever-flowing, life-giving artesian spring. Their idols are man-made, cracked, leaky holes in the ground that can hold no water at all. They have traded the source of all life for something that is empty, useless, and dead. He continues this theme later. Has a nation ever changed its gods? Yet they are not gods at all. But my people have exchanged their glorious God for worthless idols. He points out the absurdity. Even pagan nations are loyal to their fake gods. But Israel, who has the one true, living, glorious God, has eagerly traded him away for things of no value. One of the most revealing episodes in Jeremiah's ministry concerns a specific cult that had become wildly popular among the people of Judah, especially the women. This was the worship of a deity they called the Queen of Heaven, who was likely a version of the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar or the Canaanite Astarte. This wasn't a state-sponsored cult happening in the temple. This was a domestic, grassroots religious movement. In chapter 7, Jeremiah describes the scene. The children gather wood, the fathers light the fire, and the women knead the dough and make cakes to offer to the Queen of Heaven. The whole family was involved. It was a popular, vibrant, and deeply ingrained part of their community life. After Jerusalem has fallen, and a remnant of the people have fled to Egypt against Jeremiah's explicit warning, he confronts them again about this very practice. Their response is one of the most shocking and revealing passages in the Old Testament. They defiantly tell him, "We will not listen to the message you have spoken to us in the name of the Lord. We will certainly do everything we said we would. We will burn incense to the Queen of Heaven and will pour out drink offerings to her, just as we and our ancestors, our kings and our officials did in the towns of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. At that time, we had plenty of food and were well off and suffered no harm. But ever since we stopped burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, we have had nothing and have been perishing by sword and famine." Their logic is completely inverted. They had adopted a purely pagan, transactional worldview. They looked back on the wicked, idolatrous reign of Manasseh as the good old days, a time of prosperity. And they blamed their current suffering, the sword and famine brought by the Babylonians, not on their sin, but on the brief, righteous reforms of King Josiah, when the worship of the Queen of Heaven had been suppressed. They had come to believe that idolatry brought them blessing, and that faithfulness to Yahweh brought them disaster. Their hearts and minds were so thoroughly corrupted, their spiritual compass so completely broken, that they could no longer distinguish good from evil, blessing from curse. They were a people beyond the reach of reason, beyond the reach of prophetic warning, beyond the reach of repentance. And so Jeremiah's message inevitably shifted. It was no longer a conditional warning. Repent, or judgment will come. It became an unconditional announcement. Judgment is here. The Babylonians are coming. They are God's instrument of judgment. His message became one of surrender. He told the kings of Judah that their only hope for survival was to submit to the yoke of the king of Babylon. This, of course, was seen as treason. Jeremiah was branded a traitor, a fifth columnist, a demoralizing voice of doom. He was beaten, thrown in stocks, arrested, and left to die in a muddy cistern. He was a prophet utterly rejected by his own people. The spiral that began with Solomon's subtle compromises, that accelerated with Ahab's fanatical zealotry, and that hit the absolute rock bottom of human depravity with Manasseh's child sacrifices, was now reaching its inevitable end. The warnings had all been given. The second chances had all been squandered. The measure of sin, particularly the shedding of innocent blood, was now full. The great Babylonian armies, under the command of King Nebuchadnezzar, were massing on the horizon. The desperate, dying kingdom of Judah was about to reap the whirlwind it had sown. The fire of judgment was coming, not this time to an altar on a mountain, but to the holy city of Jerusalem and to the magnificent temple of Solomon itself. The long, dark night of exile was about to begin. The end, when it came, was not a single, clean strike. It was a slow, agonizing strangulation. For centuries, the prophets of God had warned that the persistent spiritual adultery of the nation would lead to a bitter divorce, that the land itself, which they had polluted with idols and innocent blood, would eventually vomit them out. And now, the agent of that eviction, the great army of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, stood at the gates of Jerusalem. The warnings of Isaiah, the tears of Jeremiah, the dire pronouncements of 100 forgotten seers had all come to this, the final reckoning. The siege of Jerusalem was a portrait of hell drawn in real time. It lasted for the better part of 2 years. The Babylonians, masters of siege warfare, built a wall around the city, cutting it off from all supplies, and then they simply waited. Inside the walls, hope decayed into desperation, and desperation curdled into madness. The city slowly starved. The Book of Lamentations, a collection of 5 sorrowful poems written in the aftermath, gives us a glimpse into the horror. Food ran out completely. The rich, who once feasted on delicacies, were now seen scavenging in the streets. The skin of the starving people grew black and shriveled, clinging to their bones. Mothers, their hearts and minds broken by famine, turned on their own children. The unspeakable horror that Moses had warned of in Deuteronomy, that in a siege you will eat the fruit of the womb, the flesh of the sons and daughters the Lord your God has given you, became a literal reality in the streets of the holy city. All the while, the false prophets within the city kept promising a last-minute miracle. They insisted that God would never allow his own city, his chosen dwelling place, to fall. They pointed to the magnificent Temple of Solomon, its golden roof still gleaming in the sun, as an inviolable talisman. The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, they would chant, as if the very presence of the building was a guarantee of divine protection. They had come to worship the temple itself, another form of idolatry, forgetting that the glory of God had already departed from it, as the prophet Ezekiel had seen in his vision. The building was now just a beautiful, empty shell. Finally, in the summer of 586 BC, the end came. The Babylonian army breached the city walls. What followed was a storm of fire and blood. The soldiers poured into the streets, killing without mercy. The houses were set on fire. The palaces were looted and burned. The city walls, which had stood for centuries, were systematically torn down. And then Nebuzaradan, the captain of Nebuchadnezzar's guard, entered the temple. His men stripped it of every last valuable. The great bronze pillars, the massive bronze sea, the golden lampstands, the silver instruments, everything was broken up and hauled away as spoil. And then they put a torch to the house of the Lord. The magnificent structure, the pride of Solomon, the heart of Israel's faith for 400 years, went up in flames. The fire that had once fallen from heaven to accept their sacrifices now fell from the hands of their enemies to consume their sanctuary. As the smoke rose over the smoldering ruins of Jerusalem, it seemed to signal the death of a nation and the utter defeat of their God. The survivors, the king, his officials, the priests, the craftsmen, and the leading citizens were rounded up, chained together, and marched off on the long, brutal journey into exile in Babylon. The poor of the land were left behind to be vine dressers and farmers, a scattered remnant in a desolate and broken country. The covenant seemed shattered. The promise to David seemed void. The land was lost. The king was a captive. The temple was gone. And the people were now refugees, slaves in a strange land, ruled by a king who worshipped strange gods. The central question that must have burned in the heart of every single exile was a terrifying one. Was Yahweh dead? Or was he simply weaker than Marduk, the great god of Babylon? Had they backed the wrong god all along? Their arrival in Babylon would have done nothing to assuage these fears. Babylon was not some dusty, provincial town. It was the center of the world, the largest, wealthiest, and most magnificent city on the face of the earth. For the Judean exiles, shuffling in chains through its massive gates, the experience must have been utterly demoralizing. They had come from the modest, hilly city of Jerusalem, now a smoking ruin. They were entering a sprawling metropolis that glittered with power and pagan glory. Imagine their first sight of the Ishtar Gate, a colossal structure covered in brilliant blue-glazed bricks, decorated with menacing golden reliefs of dragons and bulls, the symbols of the gods Marduk and Adad. This was a gateway designed to awe and intimidate, a statement of imperial power and divine favor. Inside the walls, the city was a marvel of engineering and architecture. The great processional way, paved with limestone and flanked by walls decorated with snarling lions, led to the heart of the city's religious complex. There stood the Esagila, the massive temple of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, and next to it, the Etemenenki, a towering ziggurat, a stepped pyramid reaching towards the heavens, the very structure that likely inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. This was idolatry on a scale they had never before witnessed. It wasn't a humble stone altar on a hilltop. It was a dazzling, triumphant, imperial machine, a religion whose gods had apparently conquered the world. The Babylonian religious calendar was a constant parade of festivals, processions, and rituals. The statues of the gods Marduk, his son Nabu, the goddess Ishtar were not seen as mere symbols. They were believed to be the living embodiment of the deities themselves, They were housed in magnificent temples, clothed in expensive garments, fed daily with elaborate meals, and on festival days, paraded through the streets on golden barges for the entire populace to see and worship. The success of the Babylonian Empire was seen as direct proof of the power of its gods. From a purely human perspective, all the evidence suggested that Marduk was king, and that Yahweh of Israel was, at best, a defeated minor deity. The temptation to simply give up, to assimilate, to bow down to the gods of the victors must have been overwhelming. Why continue to worship a god whose city and temple now lay in ashes? It was into this crisis of faith that God spoke through his prophets in exile, most notably Ezekiel and Daniel. Their task was to reframe the entire catastrophe, to offer a radical reinterpretation of what had just happened. Ezekiel, a priest who had been taken to Babylon in an earlier deportation, delivered a message that was both terrifying and revolutionary. He taught the exiles that the destruction of Jerusalem was not a sign of Yahweh's weakness, but a staggering display of his power and his holiness. It was not a defeat for God. It was God's own righteous judgment upon his unfaithful people. One of Ezekiel's most important visions, which he had received before the final destruction, was of the Kavod, the glorious, fiery presence of God, physically leaving the temple. He saw the wheeled throne chariot of God rise up from the cherubim in the Holy of Holies, move to the threshold of the temple, and then depart from the city altogether. The theological implication of this was world-changing for the exiles. It meant that God had not been captured or defeated by the Babylonians. He had willingly, sorrowfully, abandoned his own house because it had been so thoroughly defiled by the idols of Manasseh and the sins of the people. The Babylonians had not destroyed the house of God. They had merely burned down an empty building from which the divine tenant had already moved out. This meant that God was not confined to the land of Israel or the city of Jerusalem. His presence was with his people, even here, by the rivers of Babylon. Yahweh was not a local deity. He was the sovereign Lord of all the earth, and he could be worshipped anywhere. Ezekiel's later prophecies then shifted from judgment to hope. He gave the exiles visions of a future restoration that were almost too beautiful to believe. He saw a valley full of dry, disconnected human bones, the very image of the dead and scattered nation of Israel. But God commanded him to prophesy to the bones, and as he spoke, there was a rattling sound, and the bones came together, were covered with sinews and flesh, and the breath of God entered them, and they stood on their feet as a vast army. It was a promise of national resurrection. God would bring them back from the grave of exile. He also promised them a spiritual resurrection, an inner transformation. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees. This was the ultimate solution to their idolatry problem. God would not just give them new rules, he would give them new hearts that would actually want to obey the rules. While Ezekiel was reframing their theology, the stories of Daniel and his companions provided a practical guide for how to live faithfully in the heart of a pagan empire. These stories are powerful works of spiritual resistance, each one a demonstration of Yahweh's absolute supremacy over the gods and kings of Babylon. The pattern is consistent and powerful. The pagan king, Nebuchadnezzar or Darius, asserts his absolute, often divine, authority. Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are faced with a choice: compromise their faith or face death. They refuse to bow down. They refuse to eat the king's defiled food. They refuse to worship the golden statue. They refuse to stop praying to their God. They are sentenced to a fiery furnace or a den of lions. And in each case, Yahweh performs a spectacular, public miracle of deliverance. The three friends walk out of the furnace completely unharmed, without even the smell of smoke on their clothes. Daniel emerges from the lion's den without a scratch. The effect of these miracles is always the same. The mighty pagan king is humbled, terrified, and forced to make a public confession that the God of the Jews is the one true living God. Nebuchadnezzar, after being driven mad and living like an animal for 7 years, declares, "His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation." Darius signs a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. These stories were not just historical accounts. They were sermons in narrative form, teaching the exiles that they did not need to be afraid of the empire's power or seduced by its glory. Their God was in control, and faithfulness to him, even unto death, was the path to true life and vindication. And so, slowly, painfully, over the course of 70 years, the experience of exile worked a profound and permanent change in the soul of the Jewish people. It was a traumatic national surgery, a divine chemotherapy that finally eradicated the cancer of idolatry that had plagued them for nearly 1,000 years. This Babylonian cure worked through several key developments. First, as the prophets had taught them, they underwent a complete theological realignment. They finally understood what had happened. They saw that the idols of Babylon, Marduk, Bel, Nebo, despite their magnificent temples and their imperial sponsorship, were, as Jeremiah had said, worthless. The prophet Isaiah, writing during the exile, mercilessly mocked the practice of idolatry, describing a man who cuts down a tree, uses half of it to make a fire to warm himself and bake his bread, and then carves the other half into a god and bows down to it, praying, "Save me, you are my God." The sheer stupidity of it was laid bare. They realized that their suffering was not because Yahweh was weak, but because he was powerful and just. They saw that Yahweh had not been a passive victim of Babylonian aggression, but that he had actively used the Babylonian Empire as his servant, his instrument of judgment. This reframed their understanding of God completely. He was not just the God of Israel, he was the sovereign God of all nations, the director of all human history, who raises up empires and brings them down according to his own purposes. Their monotheism became fierce, absolute, and universal. Second, the very nature of their religious practice was forced to change. With the temple in ruins, their faith had to become portable. The entire system of animal sacrifice, the central act of their worship for centuries, was now impossible. They could no longer rely on a sacred place or a priestly ritual to connect with God. This crisis led to the development of new institutions and new religious priorities. It is in exile that the synagogue likely has its origins, local assemblies of Jews gathering, not for sacrifice, but for prayer, for the reading of the sacred texts, and for teaching. Their faith of necessity became centered not on a building, but on a book. The scrolls of the Torah, the Psalms, and the writings of the prophets became the new spiritual center of the community. A new class of leaders, the scribes, like the great Ezra, rose in importance. Their role was to meticulously preserve, copy, study, and teach the scriptures. This intense focus on the written word, on a God who reveals himself through speech and text, rather than through physical images, was a powerful and permanent antidote to the lure of visual, sensual idolatry. They went into exile as a nation with a temple. They came out as a people of the book. Third, living as an ethnic and religious minority in a vast, foreign, and often hostile pagan culture, forced them to think deeply about what it meant to be Jewish. Without the geographical boundaries of their own land, they needed to establish clear social and religious boundaries to prevent themselves from being completely assimilated and disappearing as a people. Practices that had always been part of the law now took on a new and heightened significance as crucial boundary markers. Strict observance of the Sabbath became a weekly declaration that their time belonged to Yahweh, not to the king of Babylon. The practice of circumcision was a permanent sign on their bodies that they belonged to the covenant people. The dietary laws, which forbade them from eating certain foods, made it difficult for them to even share a meal with their pagan neighbors, creating a powerful social barrier. These practices, which might have seemed secondary in their own land, now became the very fabric of their identity, a daily performance of their distinctiveness and their loyalty to their God. And then, after 70 years had passed, just as Jeremiah had prophesied, the geopolitical landscape shifted once again. The mighty Babylonian Empire, which had seemed so invincible, crumbled before a new rising power. The Persians, led by their brilliant king, Cyrus the Great. And in the very first year of his reign, 539 BC, Cyrus issued a decree that must have seemed like a dream to the aging exiles. He decreed that the Jewish people were free to return to their homeland, and in an unheard-of act of imperial policy, he commanded them to rebuild the temple of their God in Jerusalem, even offering to fund the project from the royal treasury. For the Jewish exiles, this was a miracle of the highest order. It was the ultimate vindication of their prophets and their used Babylon to judge them, but he had now used Persia to save them. The pagan King Cyrus was acting as God's anointed one, his shepherd, just as the prophet Isaiah had foretold over a century earlier. History was truly in his hands. The return from exile was not a single glorious event, but a slow, difficult process that stretched over decades. The first wave of returnees, under leaders like Zerubbabel and Joshua, the high priest, found Jerusalem still a desolate ruin, and the land occupied by suspicious and hostile neighbors. They faced immense challenges, discouragement, and internal strife. But their first priority, before even rebuilding the city walls, was to rebuild the altar and then the temple. The second temple was a modest affair compared to the glory of Solomon's, and the old men who remembered the first temple wept when they saw it. But it was a start. It was a sign that God's presence was once again with them in their land. Later, leaders like Ezra the scribe and Nehemiah the governor would return to lead the people in a spiritual and national restoration. Ezra, with the authority of the Persian king, re-established the law of Moses as the official constitution of the community. Nehemiah would oversee the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem, restoring a sense of security and dignity to the city. But the challenges they faced were profoundly different from those of their ancestors. The great temptation was no longer the worship of Baal and Asherah. When Ezra discovered that some of the people had intermarried with their pagan neighbors, the very sin that had led Solomon astray, he led the nation in a great public ceremony of weeping and repentance. They were now fiercely, even violently, opposed to the kind of idolatry and syncretism that had once defined them. They had been vaccinated against that particular disease by the trauma of the exile. The long, sordid, 1,000-year affair with the gods of the nations was finally over. The spiritual DNA of the people had been permanently resequenced. The fire of Babylon was a crucible that had burned away the dross of their pagan inclinations. The nation that had gone into that fire was a nation obsessed with high places, sacred poles, and graven images. The people who came out were the people of the book, a community defined by their fierce monotheism, their devotion to the Torah, and their separation from the Gentile world. They had finally, painfully, learned the lesson of the first and second commandments. The old gods, the golden calves of Bethel and Dan, the seductive Baal, the maternal Asherah, the horrific Molech, had at last been vanquished from their hearts, not by a single miracle on a mountain, not by the reforms of a righteous king, but by the traumatic, refining fire of national death and resurrection, and 70 years of wrestling with their God in a strange and hostile land. The stage was now set for a new era of faith, the era of post-exilic Judaism, and for the very different spiritual landscape into which, centuries later, a new voice would cry out from the wilderness, preparing the way for the Lord.